Hey everyone, thanks again for joining up with me tonight for another round of WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. It's great to have you with me tonight and following along. Tonight we're going to look into the origin of human beings and the evolutionary explanation and start introducing that subject. Obviously won't cover everything tonight, but we will look into some things to get things moving in a direction whereby we can cover some of the subject matter in this particular topic. Just have a question for you. We're in the midst of Winter Olympics or whatever. I don't even know because I'm not following it, as most of America is not really following the Olympics from what I understand. Perhaps you are. But why did the ski instructor go to college? That's the question. Why did the ski instructor go to college? Because knowledge is powder. I don't make them up. I just get them from Alexa. Knowledge is powder. So I'm going to share a little bit of powder with you tonight. I want you to know tonight we're not monkeying around except for that joke. To close out our series on origins, we're going to talk about all the supposed evidence for human evolution. Or, as I like to think of it, though it's certainly not original with me, I really like this, from goo to you by way of the zoo. I mean, that's what evolution is all about, right? From goo to you by way of the zoo. Somehow we humans got here by rising up out of some primordial ooze, some slime out there. And that's where things got started, and that's the goo, and all the way to you, and goes through the entire remnants of the zoo or whatever. That's the idea. So I want to start this evening back in 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. Well, look at that. I wonder what's going on here. It looks like we're at the headquarters for T.T. Martin's Anti-Evolution League. And it looks like they're selling books. It says Brian's books in particular. Brian's books here. Not me. I'm B-R-I-A-N. That's a B-R-Y-A-N. And I happen to know that that's the last name of someone we're going to talk about tonight. So we have two books that are advertised on the big banner, The Conflict and also Hell and the High School. So that one sounds like a good subject, good topic to read about. It's almost prophetic. 1922, the way high schools can sometimes be, even in my day, and now even more so today. So what's the background story on this particular booth here for T.T. Martin's Anti-Evolution League? Well, in March of 1925, legislation in the state of Tennessee, state legislation, in the form, passed legislation in the form of something called the Butler Act. The Butler Act prohibited public school teachers from denying the biblical account of mankind's origin. It also prohibited the teaching of evolution. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, that wonderful organization which is such a bane to most Christians in our modern era, launched a campaign to challenge this Butler Act in court. A resident of Dayton, Tennessee, George Rapolye, I assume that's how we say it, it's ye or yay, Rapolye, he came across an ad that the ACLU had put in, I guess, the local paper or a Tennessee paper somewhere, and he decided that a court trial of this magnitude, challenging the Butler Act, which would likely attract the attention of the entire nation, he decided that would really be a boost to Dayton's local economy. So that's kind of his selling point to city leaders or whatever, right, to do this thing. And Rapolye convinced a local high school gym teacher by the name of John Scopes to become a defendant in the ACLU's challenge. Now, the thing about it is, Scopes, although he was a gym teacher, was pretty sure he had never actually taught evolution. I mean, think about it. Even if the gym class utilized the playground monkey bars, it's doubtful that evolution ever came up. Look at me, I'm a monkey, Coach Scopes, or whatever they called him. But he did once substitute, okay? He did once substitute in a biology class at the very end of the school year. So it's kind of like that old commercial, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. I'm not a biology teacher, but sometimes I'm a substitute for one. Okay, so John Scopes got to be the focal point of what would become known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. And it would last through July the 21st of 1925. And after the trial was over, the great orator William Jennings Bryan hung around Tennessee for a while, made several speeches in Tennessee. And then on Sunday, the 26th of July, just a few days after the trial ended, 5, I guess, he went to a church service in Dayton. And later in that day, while sleeping, William Jennings Bryan died in his sleep of what was then called apoplexy. Today, doctors would say that he died of a stroke. Clarence Darrow, on the left there, was a famous defense lawyer, having taken on several high-profile defendants of the day before he got to this trial here. Darrow was thus known nationally as well. Marine biologist Dr. Robert Carter, in a Creation Ministries International website article on the Scopes trial, revealed this about Clarence Darrow. In 1924, just prior to his appearance at the Scopes trial, he was the defense attorney during the trial of the century, as it was called. His clients, Leopold and Loeb, those are the guys sitting there, were two rich teenage boys from Chicago who had killed their neighbor, a younger boy, for the fun of it. After the jury was assembled and the trial was ready, the judge asked Darrow how his clients would like to plead. And his reply, or rather his response, was simple. It went something like, "Your Honor, my clients would like to plead guilty." Guilty. Now this was shocking, Carter says. They were facing the death penalty. But Darrow had a plan. Once that plea was submitted, the trial moved directly to the sentencing phase. There was no jury. There was no prosecuting attorney. There was just Darrow and the judge. And Darrow took several days, 12 hours of straight talking, to make his closing argument. In fact, that defense became a text used in American law schools for the next 50 years. What was his defense? Only that his clients could not help themselves because they were a product of their evolutionary heritage. Now, folks, just think about that one for a little bit. Robert Carter goes on to say in his article, Leopold and Loeb got life in prison. Darrow was world famous. He was then picked by the ACLU to challenge the Tennessee law that forbade the teaching of human evolution. Thus, defense lawyer Clarence Darrow, operating under a full-blown evolutionary philosophy of life, this is his outlook, he is being consistent in his defense of these boys with what evolution actually teaches, okay? And now he's going to lead the defense of John Scopes in Tennessee. And in a most unusual move toward the end of the trial, Darrow called William Jennings Bryan, the prosecutor, to the stand. It was sort of an opportunity to pit these two famous lawyers together into a public debate on the topic of creation versus evolution. And Darrow quizzed Bryan first, okay? So he had Bryan in the hot seat, so to speak. And then the idea was that Bryan would later reciprocate. He would call Darrow to the stand, and he would cross-examine him. This was all arranged ahead of time so these two could talk, because everybody seemed that was good for press. It was all kinds of things. And really this whole thing was all about the press anyway, okay? So Bryan's day on the stand was July the 20th, and the proceedings that day were held outside because it was just too hot in the courtroom. But here's the thing. William Jennings Bryan never got to call Clarence Darrow to the witness stand. Before he had to sit under Bryan's questioning, Darrow convinced his client, John Thomas Scopes, to plead guilty to the crime of teaching evolution in school. Thus, Darrow escaped what would have been undoubtedly Bryan's scathing cross-examination of him, even though he laid it heavy onto William Jennings Bryan when he had a turn to question him. So pretty slick, this guy. He didn't want to stand up to or sit there while the world's greatest orator stood before him and tore him to pieces. All right, that was not good for his ego, see. Scopes was fined $100, which was later waived, okay, so some technicality or whatever. The whole thing was, of course, as I said, a show trial. It was an effort by the ACLU to overturn the Butler Act prohibiting the teaching of evolution. And at the trial, all manner of evidence supposedly supporting evolution was all presented, thus making the imagined proof of evolution a matter of public record. The fundamentalist Christians in Tennessee simply had to be stopped. That was the whole point. So then, what became of the Butler Act? What happened to it? If they lost the trial, basically, because they pled guilty, right? The defense rested on that. And so what happens with this Butler Act that they were trying to get rid of? Well, Wikipedia recounts the history like this. The law was challenged by the ACLU in the famed Scopes trial, in which John Scopes, a high school science teacher who agreed to be paid on the charge of having taught evolution and was nominally served a warrant on May the 5th, 1925. Scopes was indicted on May 25th and ultimately convicted. On appeal, the Tennessee Supreme Court found the law to be constitutional under the Tennessee State Constitution because we are not able to see how the prohibition of teaching the theory that man has descended from a lower order of animals gives preference to any religious establishment or mode of worship. So far as we know, there is no religious establishment or organized body that has in its creed or confession of faith any article denying or affirming such a theory. So there's no reason to get the law out of there. But despite this decision, here's the thing. The Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the conviction on a technicality, that the jury should have fixed the amount of the fine, not the judge. And so the case was not retried. So during the trial, John Washington Butler, the Tennessee representative who had sponsored the Butler Act, told reporters, "I never had any idea my bill would make such a fuss. I just thought it would become law." I missed somebody here. Okay. Oh, that's the thing. Okay, sorry. Here's Mr. Butler. He says, "I never had any idea my bill would make such a fuss. I just thought it would become a law, and that everybody would abide by it, and that we wouldn't hear any more of evolution in Tennessee." Well, nice try, Mr. Butler. The law remained on the books until 1967. So what? That's like 45 years later, when teacher Gary L. Scott of Jacksboro, Tennessee, who had been dismissed for violation of the act, sued for reinstatement, citing his First Amendment right to free speech. So he taught evolution, and he got dismissed, and so he sued for reinstatement, and he had to get his First Amendment right was what he gave for that. And then, although his termination was rescinded, Scott continued his fight with a class action lawsuit. Wow, wonder who's backing him on all of this. You know what I mean? Scott continued his fight with a class action lawsuit in the Nashville Federal District Court seeking a permanent injunction against enforcement of that law, the Butler law. The article you see here is from the Johnson City Press in Tennessee, May 10, 1967. Within 3 days of his filing suit, as that's what this is talking about, a bill for repeal of the Butler Act had passed both houses of the Tennessee legislature and was signed into law May 18 by Governor Buford Ellington. So, just 8 days after this article came out. John Scopes, here's John Scopes as he was in and around 1967, standing by the historical marker of the trial named after him. John Scopes was glad to hear the Butler Act was finally repealed. This article you see here appeared on May the 18th, 1967, in the Daily News Journal of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It says, Scopes happy over repeal. John T. Scopes, the central figure in the Tennessee monkey trial more than 40 years ago, is happy the law is to be repealed. And it says by fears, but I think it means but fears a more obnoxious bill, quote unquote, may follow. Quote, if the legislature has repealed the Butler Act, well then I'm very happy, Scopes said Tuesday at his home. But he said a worse bill may be substituted for it in the future. Then he says, we haven't gained anything. He hoped, quote, that type of law, end quote, would be abolished forever. So just abolish that whole idea of trying to abolish something. Okay, I follow you. Scopes was fined in 1925 for violating the law forbidding the teaching of the theory of evolution in a trial which attracted worldwide attention. The conviction was overturned on a technicality. So in the 1920s, here's the thing, the background kind of here. In the 1920s, there was this battle in America between two ideologies trying to get control of education policy. You see, it's hard for us to understand that because nothing like this ever happens in our day, right? You know, we all agree on everything and it all goes smoothly in America. Two ideologies trying to grab control of the education policy in public schools. And the theory of evolution was in the spotlight in that debate. That's why all this is happening, okay? William Jennings Bryan, who would be the prosecutor in the 1925 Scopes trial, in the early 20s, before the 25 date, 1925, he began to come down hard against the theory of evolution. And he's an orator, and he had many arguments that he presented and so forth. Now, Bryan wasn't a scientist. He's a career politician, right, from Nebraska. And there's a really fascinating story on how some on the other side sought to undermine William Jennings Bryan's credibility. And this all happened shortly before 1925 came around, and that would be the year the Butler Act would be passed, and then ultimately the Scopes trial would challenge it. So that's what's going on. So for much of the following I'm going to give you, I'm indebted to an article written by Andrew Sibley. His article can be found at creation.com, the website of Creation Ministries International. Kind of easy to remember that, just creation.com. Creation Ministries International, or CMI. So anyway, in 1917, Nebraska rancher and part-time paleontologist Harold Cook found a tooth in some sedimentary layers in northwestern Nebraska. It's kind of hilly up in there, rocky, and so forth. You're getting close to Idaho and so forth. You can see a sketch here of Cook's discovery. 5 years later, and this was actually like four sides of the four different angles of the truth, front, back, left, and right, or whatever. 5 years later, in 1922, Cook sent his tooth. Okay, 5 years later. Now just think about that for a moment. All right, he finds it in 2017. He doesn't do anything with it for 5 years, and then suddenly, Cook sends his tooth to Henry Fairfield Osborn. Okay, Henry Fairfield Osborn, who at the time was president of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Wow, in 1922, huh? That's kind of the same time as when all this controversy about evolution and so forth is happening, right? Right. Now, Osborn was a well-known vertebrate paleontologist. And Osborn took a look at Harold Cook's tooth, well, not his tooth, but the tooth that he found, right, and declared that he had found the tooth of a primitive ape man in America. Osborn gave this ape man a really fancy scientific name, too. Hesperopithecus haroldcookii. Haroldcookii, I like that. Hesperopithecus means ape of the Western world. You see, Osborn was proclaiming that he had found, well, Cook found it, but he declared it, so he found the first ape man in the West. America now had its own ape man, thanks to Harold Cook. Wow. Our own ape man. We're just like Europe now. Now think of what kind of publicity that would mean. For those back in the 1920s who were battling against fundamentalist Christians, as the evolutionists tried to make the teaching of evolution the very center of science education in America in the public schools. This discovery potentially had, therefore, political ramifications. Look, we just found an ape man in our own backyard. Come on, right? Henry Osborn was a leading member of the American Civil Liberties Union, that same organization that would seek to overturn the Butler Act in Tennessee through John Scopes, that gym teacher in Dayton. And Osborn's Hesperopithecus haroldcookii was really big news, okay? The Alliance semi-weekly times, things only happened about half the time in Alliance, I guess. The Alliance semi-weekly times, this might have been a special edition, I don't know. The Alliance semi-weekly times of Alliance, Nebraska published this particular article on April the 28th, 1922. And you can see the big yellow arrow I threw on there for you to find it really quickly. And it asks this at the beginning of the article: is Western Nebraska to furnish a solution to the greatest question of all time? Wow. The origin of the human species. Is Western Nebraska to furnish a solution to the greatest question of all time, the origin of the human species? Has the missing link between man and ape, for which scientists have long been searching, been found at last? Harold Cook, of whom the following articles speak, and they quote for some other articles further down the column there, is well known in Alliance. Everybody knows Harold Cook, where he recently lectured on geological subjects, and Alliance people are familiar with the famous Captain Cook Ranch near Agate, which is only about 60 miles northwest of here. So this is big news in Nebraska. Now remember, the only thing that had been found was a single tooth. Renowned New York paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, the very president of the American Museum of Natural History, had announced that it was a tooth of an ape man. But it was still only a tooth. Nothing else. No axe heads were found. No arrowheads or spearheads were found. No remnants of campfires or cave fires or cooking implements or anything else, just a tooth. Yet, in the London News, Sir Amédée Forestier, an Anglo-French artist and illustrator, Sir Forestier came up with this magnificent rendition of Nebraska Man. There he is. And presumably down on the ground there, that's Mrs. Nebraska by his side. The hilly landscape of Nebraska of hundreds of thousands of years ago is also populated, as you can see there, by ancient horses over on the other side of the river, directly over Mrs. She's not really too cute. Mrs. Nebraska's shoulder there. And then there's some kind of ancient rhinoceros on the other side of that tree trunk and across the creek. And then you can even see some camels back there behind Mr. Nebraska Man. Now, my hunch is, and I think this is scientific, it's as scientific as anything I've seen so far this evening. My hunch is that Mrs. Nebraska bent down to pick up a rock because she was angry with her husband. That's the look she has on her face there. And so she stands up, she growls, and then she wings that rock at his head, and the rock strikes him in the jaw, knocking out his tooth. Bingo. And many millennia later, Harold Cookie Eye finds the tooth. That's what I think happened. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, because if all of this artwork that you see can be built up out of a single tooth, well then, I can at least make up a story to fit with the picture and the tooth and bring the two together. So I think I'm going to publish and see if I can get reviewed in some scientific journal somewhere for that. But hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a real problem here. Because as it turned out, the tooth that Harold Cook found was later discovered to be the tooth of a pig. That's a peccary predicament. One of those kind. It was thought at the time that the particular pig that had that tooth was extinct, but that wasn't true either, because the same type of wild pig is still very much with us, and it looks very similar to the one that you're looking at right here. All that excitement, all of the important people internationally getting involved, all of the political angst over American education, a burning desire to try and embarrass a noted Nebraskan by the name of William Jennings Bryan. Yeah, he was from Nebraska, you see. Isn't that interesting? And of course, he was the one speaking out against evolution. All of that. And it turned out that Nebraska Man was really just a Nebraska hog. It's my understanding that fictional cavemen from everywhere were very angry at Nebraska Man for trying to cut into their territory. They were the fictional cavemen, not this guy. As they say, sometimes the tooth just hurts. In his article at creation.com, Andrew Sibley gives some insight into how evolutionists explain this troubling truthache known as Nebraska Man. I mean, what an embarrassment to their side, right? I mean, this is terrible. One of the leading people, I mean, if this was just some side guy at some, junior college science department or something claiming it to be an ape man tooth, well, that had been one thing. But this guy was in New York, all right, in the city of New York, at the as president of the American Museum of Natural History there. Wow. Andrew Sibley writes this: evolutionists today seek to play down the erroneous find, claiming that it was not widely accepted by the science community, and assert that it was a simple mistake, quickly corrected by the evolutionary scientists themselves. And this is the way science works, and we're proud of that. For example, and he quotes a couple of guys here, talks about a couple, Wolf and Mellett claim that other discoveries help to limit the damage to evolutionary science from the fallout from Hesperopithecus, such as that of Australopithecus and Sinanthropus, the later more commonly known as Peking Man. He said those things kind of redeemed, the other discoveries come along, and it retards the damage caused by this pig man rather than ape man, I guess. The fraudulent Piltdown Man find, that was another one, and we'll talk about that in a later lesson, probably next week. The fraudulent Piltdown Man find was also working its magic in the minds of people and helping to craft the acceptance of evolution in society during the period of the 1920s. See, Piltdown Man wasn't discovered to be fraudulent until about 40 years after it was found. In the 1920s, Piltdown Man was still really good evidence for human evolution. However, he goes on to say, it's not so easy to play down the way Nebraska Man was handled as being a simple error. An examination of the available evidence and statements suggested it was not only used to promote evolution in the mind of the public, ahead of the important and carefully arranged court case. He's talking about the Scopes trial, right? But also, it was to undermine Bryan, who was the chief opponent of evolution in America at the time. All right. There's enough here already to suggest that the drive to dominate in the political arena and in American schools everywhere may well also have pushed enthusiasm to call this tooth the tooth of an American ape man. We really need something like that right now. From Nebraska, no less. William Bryan's home state. In fact, it all sounds a little bit too convenient. Andrew Sibley says later in his article, as a result of religious and patriotic sentiment in many parts of America, evolution was not totally accepted in American society. Well, good. With creationist teaching continuing in many schools. Recognizing the threat posed by Bryan to evolution, Osborne, as the leading establishment figure in America for the Darwinists, okay, because he's the president of the Museum of Natural History there in New York, America, right? He began to campaign then against Bryan. It was in the New York Times of the 5th of March of 1922 that Osborne wrote an article challenging Bryan to not be afraid to look at the evidence for evolution. Osborne commented, he said, if Mr. Bryan, with open heart and mind, would drop all his books and all the disputations among the doctors and study firsthand the simple archives of nature, all his doubts would disappear. He would not lose his religion. He would become an evolutionist. We'll probably talk a little bit about all the evidence that's out there and how easy it is to just go and look at the evidence for yourself, and not even if you're a scientist, not even if you're a world-leading paleontologist. You can't see everything that's there. They won't let you. Rather conveniently, only 9 days later, on the 14th of March 1922, Osborne received the well-worn tooth from the very state of Nebraska that Bryan was from. Oh my goodness, it's a gift from heaven, except we don't believe in that. At the very least, this tooth clouded Osborne's judgment, as Wolf and Mellett suggest, and perhaps he couldn't contain his excitement in announcing the evidence to the world as an American ape man. At the National Academy of Science announcement in 1922, Osborne used this artifact to mock Bryan's faith, suggesting that Bryan should consult a certain passage in the book of Job. Speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee. Osborne commented that this was a, quote, remarkable coincidence that the first earth to speak on this subject is the sandy earth of the Middle Pliocene Snake Creek deposits of western Nebraska, end quote. Coincidence indeed. But Osborne also suggested, with a mocking tone, that Hesperopithecus should really be named Bryopithecus, calling Bryan the most distinguished primate in Nebraska. Now, that's awful kind. A sad, sad tale, really. Unprofessionally foisting a rush-to-judgment analysis of a tooth, with no real scientific integrity at all. The head of a major American museum of natural history played really loose with the truth. Even though the truth came out later about the pig tooth, the truth of the pig tooth, the damage to what Americans believed was done. Remember what the Alliance Nebraska newspaper said? Is Western Nebraska to furnish a solution to the greatest question of all time, the origin of the human species? Has the missing link between man and ape, for which scientists have long been searching, been found at last? Wow. Playing with the public's mind. Getting them over on the side. You know, it's kind of like those things when it's a really big story and really important and significant, and somebody's going to be slammed, and somebody else is going to be vindicated, and it's right there on the front page, and bam, 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 bam. Then when it's found out that wasn't really true, the retraction is somewhere back on page 43 in the bottom of a column that's only going to be there for, like, on a few of the editions, because they take it out before they publish the rest of it, or whatever. The greatest question we have, ladies and gentlemen, is apparently we have no idea where we've come from. That's the greatest question. This is the kind of thing that's being told to Americans in the press. How many people do you think really liked the paper back in those days? Well, that's the days when the press was honest and you could understand. It's not like today where everybody lies. The links to the chain of evidence that will give us our answers to that question, why, they're missing. The links are missing. We don't have all the evidence. We have to keep digging. We have to keep looking. We need more funding. We need better education. We need to have this taught in schools so we can raise up more people to look, because we need to answer this question, the greatest question we have. We're on the brink of it, but and then there's those fundamentalists that are just messing with everything. I mean, not even a nod in the paper to the book of Genesis in the Bible at all. It's like it's completely gone. These were the roaring 20s. Everybody was having a great time till about 5 years, 6, 7 years later. And then there's the Scope trial itself. All from the same time frame, the roaring 20s. Those Scopes pled guilty, and Darrow's lost at trial. The ACLU's purpose to promote evolution through the press and into the American way of thinking through this trial worked significantly well. Evolution got a lot of press off of this. Clearly based on the Leopold and Loeb trial in Chicago of the previous year, Darrow was underhanded and immoral. He actually argued that the two teenagers were not responsible for their actions in killing the younger neighbor boy. I mean, evolution made them do it, right? They're not responsible. You mean that same evolution based upon a pig's tooth? Every piece of evidence for evolution that was used in the 1925 Scopes trial is no longer believed by evolutionists today. Nothing presented in that case supports evolution whatsoever. And yet that trial was a major coup by the devil to convince Americans that evolution is true and that the Bible is false. Now that ought to teach us a great deal about human sin nature. People don't want to believe the truth. People don't want God in their lives. I think most people who believe evolution today believe it not because it's been proven to them. I think they believe it simply because by now it's been believed by a lot of people for a long time. Adolf Hitler said, if you want to get people to believe a lie, you have to keep repeating it loud enough and long enough, and eventually people will believe it. Everybody believes it, this evolution thing, so it must be true. Everybody says it. The History Channel website described the 1925 Scopes trial atmosphere in Dayton, Tennessee like this. Outside Dayton took on a carnival-like atmosphere, as an exhibit featuring two chimpanzees and a supposed missing link opened in town. And vendors there sold Bibles. Read your Bible, says the guy's sign. Vendors also sold toy monkeys. Those ladies on the left, they have toy monkeys that they were selling. And the one on the right represented those monkeys. Sock puppets. I think sock monkeys. Sock monkeys must have come out of Dayton, Tennessee, or at least they got popularized through that. Ever wonder where the sock monkey comes from? Now you know. Hot dogs were on sale. Lemonade. It was carnival time in Dayton, Tennessee. The missing link was, in fact, Joe Vians of Burlington, Vermont. I couldn't find a picture of him, but I put this on here. Joe Vians was a 51-year-old man. He was short in stature, and he possessed a receding forehead and a protruding jaw. So he sold himself as the missing link, or somebody did. Somebody marketed him out there. Now you see, this is the Darwin's Monkey Trot. It was a piece of music written by somebody, and they came to promote it at this trial site, Darwin's Monkey Trot, and they gave copies of the music gratis to both William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. One of the chimpanzees, named Joe Mendy, wore a plaid suit, a brown fedora, and white spats, and entertained Dayton citizens by monkeying around on the courthouse lawn. I think there was a lot of monkeying around at the courthouse in the summer of 1922 there. It seems like the doctrine and philosophy of evolution has brought many monkey shines of all kinds. But the reality of human origins is not going to be found, folks, by digging around in the dust of Nebraskan hills or even in the dust of distant Africa. Oh, that familiar out of Africa theory. Not going to find it by digging around in the dust, because the Bible tells us this. The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. We're the dust already. And breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Wow. The psalmist writes this, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, O God, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." We are created by God. We're made in his image, made from the dust of the ground. And now we have people digging through the dust of the ground, trying to find the truth about our origins, choosing to not believe God, to not listen to what God says, turning him away, trying to keep him out of the schools, trying to keep him out of sporting events. Can't pray to God before a sporting event. My goodness. A lawsuit will ensue. And all these things I'm talking about were like, 20, 30 years ago, right? Now look at today. We are reaping what we have sown. I didn't have a good closing for this, and I'm just thinking, kind of flying off the cuff. Turn on some big lights here. Let me just come to you a moment. Just want to look at Romans chapter 1 to close out here. Talking about worshiping the creation more than the Creator. The Apostle Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith." I'm reading from chapter 1 of Romans, just read verse 16, and I'm in 17. "For in the gospel, in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." So the righteousness of God is revealed. And then verse 18 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." They hold the truth down. They keep it at bay. We don't want it. We don't want to hear it. Why do they want to keep it at bay? Well, they're suppressing it. Why? Because what is known, what may be known of God, is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. All they have to do is quit reading all their books, reading all their scientific papers, having all their conferences, and practicing all kinds of confirmation bias amongst themselves. All they have to do is give that up and just take a look at nature. Take a look at the creation, and they'll see for themselves. God's shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. The invisible things of God can be seen, being understood, how? By the things that he made. Even his eternal power and Godhead are on evidence, so that they are without excuse. But they don't want to do that, see? Now, they'd rather read on the origin of species by Charles Darwin. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, empty, vain in their thoughts. And their foolish hearts were darkened, professing themselves to be wise. We're educated, you see. They became fools. Proud, arrogant fools. And changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and also birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. See, it's creeping thing, it's goo to you by way of the zoo, right there in that verse. Worshipping all those things, our ancestors. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts. This is where the consequences come in, okay? Of believing these things. Because they believed these things, God gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, that we can become gods. That's the lie. That's the lie Satan told. And they worshipped and served the creature, the zoo, rather than the Creator, the one who is the creator of Zoe, the creator of life, the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. See, when you throw off God, you throw off morality. Oh, vile passions. These boys killed. They couldn't help it. Their evolutionary past led them to do that kind of thing. They're not responsible for their actions. Vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Oh, homosexuality, okay. Men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. You see, the seeds for all of what's happening today have been sown decades ago, before the revolution of sexual revolution in the 1960s, well before that, 40 years before that, in the roaring 20s, and even before that, back to 1859 when Darwin published his book on the origin of species. Men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. It's when people begin to say that good is evil and evil is good. That's where we are, folks. That's where we are today. I thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this has helped you to understand a little bit more of the problem that evolution as a teaching brings. It's not just about science. It's not at all about science. It's about where we come from and what we think we ought to be doing for ourselves apart from any kind of God to whom we have no responsibility. We don't want to be held accountable to him. Sadly, they will. You folks, have a good evening.